Hello and welcome everybody to today's webinar on ECHA's guidance for the new CLP hazard classes. We're glad to have you here as we get into the latest developments that strengthen the protection of human health and the environment. I'm Adam Elwan and I'm your host today. So to start us off, we'll be covering an overview of the new classes. This includes an introduction to the regulatory context and the criteria used to classify endocrine disruptors for human health and the environment, as well as for substances that have persistent, bioaccumulative, toxic, and mobile properties. We'll then be diving into detailed guidance on the criteria and process. You'll learn about our guidance structure, the specific decision-making criteria, and the steps required for adequately classifying substances and mixtures under CLP. Next, we'll discuss key concepts and practical considerations. Here, we'll explain the protection goals behind these new hazard classes, along with labeling elements and concentration limits, so you can better understand what these changes mean in practice. Finally, we'll give some insights on guidance development and timelines. You can send your questions throughout the event by going to slido.com and using the event code CLP 2024. Or you can use the QR code that's visible on this slide. Your questions will be answered during the live Q&A. Now you can also upvote questions, and I recommend using this feature so that we make sure to cover those that are most relevant for you. If you have a question directly to one of the speakers, add their name so that we know who to address it to. Now we can only cover topics within the scope of today's webinar. That said, if you do have questions that are not directly related, you can still send them to us using our contact form at echa.europa.eu/contact. A Q&A with answers to all the questions we receive will be published after the event. If your question is not answered by the time we close, you will find your answer in the published Q&A. The presentations are already downloadable on our website, and the video recording will be available right after the event. So, our program today includes presentations from several experts who have been deeply involved in the development of these new classifications. To kick things off, we'll hear from Stine Husa, who will provide an overview of the new CLP hazard classes. Stine will set the stage by introducing the regulatory context for these new classifications. She'll be giving us the foundational knowledge we need before moving in to the specific hazard classes. Following Stine, Kirsi Myöhänen will present the new CLP hazard classes specifically for endocrine disrupting properties that impact human health. Kirsi will guide us through the regulatory background, protection aims, and classification criteria, as well as the detailed guidance we have developed to support these classifications. Our next speaker will be Marta Sobanska, who will focus on endocrine disrupting properties that impact the environment. Marta will be talking about regulatory context and the aims of these classifications, explaining the criteria and guidance that apply to protecting environmental health from endocrine disruptors. Next, we'll hear from Konstantinos Prevedoros, who will cover the new CLP hazard classes for substances with persistent, bioaccumulative, toxic, and mobile properties. Konstantinos will outline the regulatory goals and give insight into the criteria and guidance developed for these classifications. Then, to wrap up today's session, I'll share a few key takeaways and final thoughts, summarizing the main points we've covered before we start the live Q&A. All right, it's time to give the floor to our first presenter, Stine Husa, on the new CLP hazard classes. Stine, over to you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Stine Husa, and I'm a scientific officer here at ECHA working in the Hazard Assessment Directorate. In this short presentation, I will give you a brief introduction to the new hazard classes in CLP and the guidances which have been developed for these hazard classes. Following this introduction, my colleagues will continue and give you more details to these topics. The outline for this presentation is the legal framework for the new hazard classes under CLP, the regulatory timelines for these hazard classes, and introduction to the new guidance for the new hazard classes, which are endocrine disruptors for human health, endocrine disruptors for the environment, and then substances with persistent, bioaccumulative and toxic properties, or very persistent, very bioaccumulative properties, and persistent, mobile or toxic properties, or very persistent, very mobile properties. During the webinar, we will address the protection goals and the classification criteria for the new hazard classes, as well as the development of the associated CLP guidance. The CLP regulation is the legal framework for classification and labeling of chemicals in the EU. This regulation is using building blocks from the United Nations Globally Harmonized System, GHS, and CLP implements the UN GHS classification criteria into European legislations and thereby ensures a high level of protection for human health and the environment and free movement of substances, mixtures, and articles. The new hazard classes for ED and PBT-PMT was introduced to CLP through a Commission Delegated Act which was adopted in April 2023. The need to establish a legally binding hazard identification of endocrine disruptors and PBTs, PMTs is highlighted in the Commission's Chemical Strategy for Sustainability towards a Toxic-Free Environment. The aim of the new hazard classes is to better protect human health and the environment by addressing emerging concerns in chemical safety. In addition, the revision of the CLP Regulation, CLP 2.0, was adopted by the Council on the 14th of October 2024, and the publication in the official journal is anticipated by the end of 2024. So in this slide, you will see an overview over the new hazard classes introduced into the CLP regulation. The hazard class for endocrine disruptors is divided into human health and the environment, and for each of these there are two categories, which applies for known or presumed endocrine disruptors in category 1 and for suspected endocrine disruptors in category 2. The hazard class for PBT, vPvB, and PMT, vPvM have no subcategories. These are the new hazard statements introduced, which are linked to the hazard classes I showed you in the previous slide. Please note that there are currently no pictogram linked to these hazard classes. The signal word to be used for endocrine disruptors is danger for category 1 or warning for category 2. For PBTs and PMTs, only danger is used. There are transitional periods in place for when the new classification and labeling applies for substances and mixtures. From 1st of May 2025 at the latest, substances shall be labeled in accordance with the new criteria. However, for substances which were placed on the market before the 1st of May 2025 are not required to be labeled in accordance with the new criteria until 1st November 2026. Similarly, for mixtures, from 1st May 2026 at the latest, mixtures shall be labeled in accordance with the new criteria. However, mixtures which were placed on the market before 1st May 2026 are not required to be labeled in accordance with the new criteria until 1st May 2028. For substances that has previously been identified as EDs or PBTs under other legislation, including REACH, the Plant Protection Products Regulation, and the Biocidal Products Regulation, the revised CLP regulation introduces specific rules. Consequently, the Commission can add substances with these properties directly to the list of harmonized classification and labeling, which is Annex 6 of CLP, according to certain timelines. These timelines will be further addressed in the revised CLP regulation, which are soon to be published. For EDs conclusion based on the ED criteria for the BPR or PPPR corresponds to category 1 under CLP, and for these substances a direct transfer is foreseen to Annex 6. For biocidal or pesticidal active substances concluded as not meeting the ED criteria, the outcome is depending on the data available for the reassessment. And for ED substances of very high concern under REACH, the corresponding classification under CLP is category 1, and for these substances a direct transfer is foreseen. And similar details for the PBTs will be presented later in this webinar. Following the introduction of the new hazard classes into CLP, the guidance on the application of the CLP criteria has been updated. The new guidance outlines the hazard classes and has been developed by experts from ECHA, EU member states, EU-level non-governmental organizations and associations, as well as other nominated experts. The updated guidance will be published in November 2024. Please note that experienced criteria might lead to updates of the guidance in the future. In this slide, you can see the timelines for the development of the guidance on endocrine disruptors. As you can see, this has been an extensive work including several rounds of meetings and consultations, and in total approximately 5,600 comments have been addressed during the process. A similar timeline was followed for the work on the guidance on PBT-PMTs. And for this piece of guidance, approximately 3,300 comments were received during the process. So overall, approximately 9,000 comments have been reviewed, considered and replied to for the new guidance on EDs and PBTs. Finally, the key message I would like you to take home is take note of the transitional period. The first deadline is already a few months from now in May 2025. Start classifying substances and mixtures already now. Use the new guidance and join workshop on new hazard classes, which will be arranged in 2025. With this, I would like to wish you a good continuation of the webinar and thank you for listening.
Hello, my name is Kirsi Myöhänen and I work in Classification Unit of European Chemicals Agency. I will tell you a short overview on the new CLP criteria for endocrine disruption for human health and the new related guidance on endocrine disruptors on CLP. First, I will shortly introduce the background, followed by a few words about the main criteria in CLP regulation for ED human health, and finally some main themes from the ECHA CLP guidance on endocrine disruptors. So let's start with the regulatory context and the protection aims. Commission adopted already 4 years ago the chemical strategy for sustainability, and even 4 years before that, in 2016, Commission identified increased scientific knowledge and experience gained in identifying EDs, and that EDs are increasing concern in society. These evaluations led endocrine disruptors to be part of the CLP regulation, following one substance, one assessment concept, and thus improving to have a harmonized approach for the ED identification throughout the EU. More scientifically, it is recognized that endocrine disruptors cause serious health issues, such as birth defects, developmental, reproductive or neurodevelopmental disorders, cancer, diabetes and obesity, both in adults and children. As a conclusion, moving hazard classification from biocides, plant protection products and REACH regulations to the CLP improves protection of human health and environment, and one substance, one assessment concept. Let's move to the second part of this presentation, the overview of the human health criteria in CLP regulation for endocrine disruptors. So you can find the full criteria in Annex 1 of CLP in section 3.11. And here in this slide you can see the main criteria for category 1 and category 2. So the evidence may come from human, animal or from non-animal data, and there needs to be the 3 elements: endocrine activity, adverse effects and the biologically plausible link between these 2. So for category 2, actually the criteria are very similar, and you classify for category 2 when the evidence is not sufficiently convincing for category 1. And to summarize, for substances, there needs to be information on the 3 elements, but in contrary for mixtures, classification is based on ingredient-based approach. And this means if there is a substance classified as endocrine disruptor for category 1 in a mixture above or equal this 0.1 concentration limit, then also the mixture should be classified. The corresponding classification limit for category 2 is 1%. However, it's normally not that simple, since these are generic limits, and if there is substance-specific data indicating that lower or different, even exceptional cases, higher limit should be applied, then a so-called specific concentration limit should be used. As a last point, on this slide, I would like to mention that the ED-CLP criteria, they apply to all modalities. So not only for EATS, but also for non-EATS modalities. And this is how the endocrine disrupting substances and mixtures appear for users, such as generic public or workers, but there is still a long way to get there. To see those in packages as shown in Stine's presentation on these transitional periods and application dates. There are so-called EU-specific hazard statements, EUH 380 and 81 for ED human health, and for comparison you can see here also the ED environmental statements, which Marta will tell more about in her presentation. Currently there are no pictograms for the labeling, but they may come if applied via GHS. For signal words there are danger and warning depending on category, and list of relevant precautionary statements you can find in the CLP regulation. Now we can move to the last part of presentation, where we dive a little bit into the details what we have in the new guidance. So ED-CLP guidance is published in November 24, and it has been a 2-year intensive project where all relevant actors, including member state stakeholders, Commission and EFSA and committees, were involved. So this guidance is part of the existing CLP guidance and application of the CLP criteria, and it follows the same structure. However, relevant parts from ECHA 2018 ED guidance have been utilized. And here you can see on the right side a picture of the cover page for this guidance, which is part 3 for all human health hazard classes under CLP, and the endocrine disruptors are under section 3.11. The table of contents in the guidance is really long for EDs, so it includes, for example, definitions, classification of substances, which consist of identification and evaluation of the data, and decision on classification, how to set specific concentration limits, and further on mixture classification, how to classify mixtures, and then the labeling parts, and finally the examples. When we look a little bit more inside to the guidance, you can see, for example, that so-called ECHA-mediated parameters are considered very similarly as in the ECHA-EFSA 2018 ED guidance. So from ED-mediated parameters, you can infer endocrine activity, and thus separate information on endocrine activity may not be needed to be able to classify for category 1 or category 2 endocrine disruptor. Whereas, for instance, for sensitive 2 parameters, separate activity data is needed to demonstrate activity and further the biologically plausible link. In a case, effects that are by default ED-mediated are seen, but the mechanism is non-ED, then there needs to be a comparative mode of action analysis. And these ED effects seen are considered human relevant by default, unless there is evidence conclusively demonstrating that the effects are not relevant for humans. And this is directly as in the legal text, so we didn't have much more specific guidance on this aspect. When we go to look at the co-occurring other toxicity when seeing the ED effects, the approach in CLP legal text is slightly different and more strict than that in the ECHA-EFSA guidance. So if endocrine adversity is solely a non-specific, not a specific consequence of other toxicity. For example, when there is so severe or excessive other toxicity that the whole body collapses and all type of effects appear, then the classification may be dismissed. But we also note that the type of severe and excessive toxicity should not occur if the tests are performed according to the OECD test guidelines, and thus the effects that are seen at the top dose or at the maximum tolerated dose should be considered for classification. And shortly giving some examples on that, for example, 10% reduction in body weight gain or liver enzyme induction is not excessive toxicity. So if ED effects occur in the presence of less than excessive toxicity, a comparative mode of action analysis is again needed to dismiss the ED effects. In the guidance, we have dedicated sections for thyroid, neuro, and immunotoxicological effects, since they are closely related to endocrine disruption. On thyroid, all mode of actions are considered relevant to humans by default, and for thyroid, there is not necessarily a need to have specific activity data when the effects on thyroid weight and histopathology are seen, since they are ED-mediated effects and the activity can be inferred from this adversity. For classification decision, all available relevant data shall be considered under CLP, and classification is based on weight of evidence and expert judgment. In some cases, there is not necessarily a need to identify a specific mode of action, since there are several modalities that may be affected simultaneously. Regarding the border between category 1 and 2, there is no detailed guidance on that, since there were some divergent opinions during the guidance development, and more experience needs to be gained from example RAC assessment to be able to provide more detailed guidance on the borders between Cat 1, Cat 2, and also no classification. However, the categorization depends on several factors that are listed here on this slide. For instance, reliability of the information, divergences of the results, if there are doubts on human relevance, and so on. In the guidance, there is also a list of factors leading to no classification, which you may find useful. Which They are, for example, when there is no adversity, no endocrine activity, or no biologically plausible link, or if there is a severe other toxicity, as I mentioned, or if there is a non-endocrine mode of action which is more plausible, and in cases if the effects are conclusively demonstrated not to be relevant for humans. About mixture classification, as explained earlier, a mixture shall be classified as ED for human health when at least one component has been classified as CAT1 or CAT2 ED, and it's present at or above this generic or specific concentration limits. And data on mixture can be used only if the results are more severe, if it results more severe classification than the ingredient-based approach. And I also wanted to mention that additivity applies for endocrine disruptors when there is, for instance, similar mechanism, mode of action, or adverse outcome. There are some detailed instructions in the guidance how to set specific concentration limits for EDs, and the method depends on the type of effect. So whether it's a cancer type of effect, reproductive effect, or target organ endocrine effect. So there are different methods for that, and also very low specific concentration limits may be set for extremely potent endocrine disruptors. For human health, there are only category 1 examples in the guidance, which may help you in understanding how to classify a substance. So there are examples on estrogenic, anti-androgenic, thyroid, and non-EATS modalities. And we actually initially drafted category 2 examples as well, but they were not included due to divergent views, and we need to wait for more experience from RAC opinions to be able to provide guidance on category 2 examples. To summarize, there are still some open points in the guidance, but it's an iterative process, and we will update the guidance when more experience is gained. So this was all from what I wanted to tell you, and thank you very much for listening.
Hello, my name is Marta Sobańska. I work in the classification and labeling team at ECHA. And today I will talk about the classification of endocrine disruptors for the environment. In my presentation, I will give a brief overview of the classification and labeling criteria for the ED for environment, and I will talk about new ECHA CLP guidance on endocrine disruptors for the environment. But let's start with the criteria. Similarly as in the case of ED classification for human health, classification for the environment refers to the specific endocrine mode of action leading to the adverse effect. Similarly, like ED human health, for classification criteria require evidence for 3 elements: endocrine activity, adverse effects, and biologically plausible link between them. The ED hazard class distinguishes between 2 categories. Category 1, which covers known or presumed endocrine disruptors for environment, and Category 2, that covers suspected endocrine disruptors for the environment. Regarding the hazard communication, at the moment there are new hazard statements, but there are no pictograms yet for these new ED hazard classes. And coming to the guidance, it is important here to note that the CLP guidance will implement relevant parts of ECHA-EFSA guidance, and in addition it will follow closely the structure for other hazard classes that are covered in this CLP guidance. Here on the right, you can see the picture of the cover page of the CLP guidance. ED part for the environment is included in the Part 4, Section 4.2. And the structure of the ED parts for the environment and human health are very much the same. And the text of both parts have been aligned wherever possible. The guidance contains the relevant definitions, criteria, and decision logic for the classification of substances, but it also covers decision logic for classification of mixtures and information on hazard communication. We also provide in the guidance some practical examples that will explain how to classify the substance as ED environment category 1. Regarding the scope of the guidance, similarly like for human health, CLP criteria cover all endocrine modalities. So the general principles outlined in the guidance are applicable to both so-called EATs, estrogen, androgen, thyroid, and steroidogenic modalities, and non-EATs modalities. Because of the status of the current knowledge, relatively good mechanistic understanding and availability of the standardized test guidelines, the main focus of our guidance is on effects caused by EATs modalities. It is also important to state that the ED classification for the environment and for human health is independent, which means that the classification for ED human health does not automatically translate into classification for ED environment, and vice versa. Regarding the taxa covered, the current guidance is in line with the ECHA guidance, and it focuses on vertebrate organisms, mainly fish and amphibians. And it does not specifically cover birds, reptiles, or invertebrates. However, if information on this taxa is available, it can be used to conclude on classification. Regarding the use of mammalian data, as indicated in both OECD Guidance 150 and ECHA guidance, information on mammals can inform about endocrine disruption of non-mammalian vertebrates. However, data on mammals and other taxa should be considered together in the holistic weight of evidence approach. Regarding the aspects on population relevance, the CLP criteria stipulate that substances and mixtures fulfilling the ED criteria must be considered as ED for the environment unless there is evidence conclusively demonstrating that the adverse effects identified are not relevant at the population level. The criteria also stipulates that only when there is evidence conclusively demonstrating that the adverse effects are not relevant at the population level, the substance must not be considered an ED for the environment. So the assessment of scientific evidence must consider if adverse effects identified may impact the maintenance of wildlife population. But on the other hand, this consideration is in line with the general level of protection for ecotoxicology, where the population of wildlife is the entity to be protected. In the section on population relevance in the new guidance, we discuss the relevance of different parameters observed in the available ecotoxicological studies, such as effects on growth, development and reproduction, behavioral changes, effects observed in non-reproductive organs, and so on. It is also important to emphasize, when evaluating mammalian data, that adverse effects observed in mammals in the context of environment have to be considered from different perspectives, not as adverse effects in individual organisms, but as adverse effects in wildlife species at the level of population. And when discussing the effect levels, besides statistical significance and biological relevance, also the pattern of effects needs to be observed. When addressing population relevance, some special considerations need to be taken for thyroid. When using mammalian data, it is important to understand if there are other effects which may be caused by the same ED mode of action and can further support the conclusion on population relevance. For example, thyroid histopathological findings observed in rats are relevant at population level if observed together with impairment of growth, development, or reproduction, or with support of other data in the weight of evidence approach. However, if the other potential effects related to the same mode of action were not investigated, the population relevance cannot be excluded. In case of amphibians, normally apical endpoints are investigated together with thyroid histopathology, so population relevance can be excluded only if thyroid histopathological changes were observed and development was investigated, but no concomitant effects were observed. And here we have to as well take into account that the power of the test was sufficient to elicit the effect. Nevertheless, changes in development in amphibians, even if observed in the absence of investigation of thyroid histopathology, are considered population-relevant effect. Regarding co-occurring other toxicity, substances shall not be classified as ED if endocrine adversity is solely a non-specific consequence of other toxicity. For example, the co-occurring toxicity is so severe that animals are suffering or dying. The presence of other toxic effects must not be used to dismiss classification unless it can be unequivocally demonstrated that the potentially endocrine-related adverse effects are solely non-specific consequences of other toxic effects. However, considering the complexity of the endocrine system, this must be assessed carefully on case-by-case basis, taking into account the full picture of the situation. Decision logic for classification is the same as for human health. Classification is based on the strength of evidence for adversity, endocrine activity, and biological link between them. Also, the same factors impact a decision on classification, the substance in relevant categories, and the same elements as in human health apply when deciding on no classification. And as I already said, ultimately, the weight of evidence approach and expert judgment is needed to decide to classify the substance on appropriate category. And again, classification of mixtures has already been explained in the human health part of the presentation. And basically, ED classification on mixtures is based on the presence of the ingredient classified for endocrine disruption. And the generic concentration limits are the same as for human health EDs. To align the protection level for environment EDs with human health, the specific concentration limits have been used for the most potent ED substances. According to the CLP regulation, generic concentration limits are assigned to substance in mixtures unless data justifies setting the specific concentration limits. And similarly, like for human health, the specific concentration limits are set based on the potency of the adverse effects, the way of setting the SCL for ED for environment, depends on the source of data used for classification. And in the ED guidance, we have explained how to derive SCLs for environment. And here the outline of this is presented in the colorful table on the slide. Finally, in the guidance, we present 3 examples which may help as well to understand how to classify the substance in category 1. So to summarize, as already explained in the previous presentation, there are still some open issues, but we consider preparation of this guidance as the iterative process, and we will update the guidance when more experience is gained. Thank you for your attention.
Good morning from my side. My name is Konstantinos Prevedouros. I have been working in ECHA since 2007. Currently, and for the last 8 years or so, I have been working for the classification labeling unit of ECHA. And I have been responsible coordinating the guidance development for the new hazard classes for PBT, vPvB, and PMT, vPvM properties during the last 2 years or so. So we will say a few things about the regulatory context, protection aims, the criteria, and the guidance development process itself. So the outline of the presentation will go like this. We will start with the context and protection aims. We will talk about classification criteria as well as labeling elements. Very high level, I have to say beforehand. We do not have the time now to go into detail, but maybe during the questions and answer session, we can go a little bit further in technical detail. Then I will concentrate a little bit on mobility, which is the new kid in town, some things about the context and the CLP considerations relating to mobility, the guidance development, and just to repeat what you already heard, that basically this is one of many other events, webinars that we are currently planning, and we will communicate via the ECHA channels, the website, very, very soon. So why did these new hazard classes need to enter into CLP? Basically, for the PBT substances, we have already extensive experience dealing with such cases in different contexts, in REACH, but beyond REACH as well. So we know the danger posed by such substances. They're very difficult to break down. They accumulate in living organisms across the food web. We have still ongoing emissions, which means that the environmental concentrations are building up with time. They have the potential for long-range transport, aquatic or atmospheric, and they're very difficult to reverse the exposure. So we do not basically know what are the effects in the long scale. Now, relating to the PMT properties, there are similar concerns in a way relating to persistence. They do not break down very, very easily. On top of that, they're very mobile. They can move between compartments and at distances, also based on the low adsorption potential. Of course, the key reason for the concern is that there is no available regulatory framework to manage such substances with this specific combination of properties. So due to their mobility, they can enter the water circle, they can enter drinking water, which is very important to protect the water resources. They spread distances from sources, and as for PBTs also, they have ongoing emissions, and they're building up in the environment, leading to exposures of humans and the environment. So the key protection aim and goal of the legislator here is to protect the water resources. The PBT criteria, I will not repeat them. Those of you that are familiar with REACH, they're identical with Annex 13 of REACH for persistence and bioaccumulation and toxicity. So exactly the same criteria. Whereas for the PMT substances, the P and the T are identical as the PBT assessment and classification criteria that are similar to the Annex 13 of REACH, as I just said, with the addition of mobility. The criteria, numerical criteria for mobility is the low KOC below 3 for a substance to be considered mobile, and the low KOC below 2 for a substance to be considered very mobile. And here I leave the actual legal text of what are the exact criteria that need to be met for T, basically, classification as a carcinogen or a mutagenic substance or a toxic for reproduction, etc. This slide you have partly seen before. I just leave it for a couple of seconds in the screen. Refers to some hazard labeling elements of how it appears in Annex 1 of CLP. Basically, the key difference with what you may remember from aquatic hazards is the current lack of pictogram that may be introduced in the future. So this KOC or low KOC refers to the octanol organic carbon water partition coefficient, and it reflects the ability of the substance to be absorbed into the organic fraction of solid matrices, environmental matrices such as soil, sediment, etc., and thus have the potential to enter groundwater. This definition was extracted directly from the delegated act that was amended in 2023, that amended CLP and Annex 1 of CLP to introduce mobility and the new hazard classes. So this definition comes directly from the delegated act. And on the right-hand side, you can see of the screen, you can see how the legal text, the wording of the legal text, with a specification on the ionizable chemicals that you need to take the low KOC basically within a given range of pH values. Now, mobility, as we said in the very beginning, is the new kid in the block. Basically, it has not been regulated so much in the past. REACH Annex 2 does refer to mobility specifically in soil as the potential of the substance, if released, to move to groundwater or to distance from the site of release. This is how REACH Annex 2 defines mobility in soil, and you have an almost identical definition of mobility in soil also in GHS. So the low KOC is a standard information requirement under REACH and biocides. And as I said, it is a novel approach, a novel index basically to extrapolate or to account for mobility in the environment. And under REACH and CLP, there's very limited, next to nothing, small experience dealing with. There is a higher experience dealing with leaching, for example, under pesticides and biocides. But here we have to keep in mind that we're talking about risk assessments and not hazard assessments or hazard identification process like the one in CLP. So here we are drilling a little bit on the exact information requirements, or the information that is needed to properly assess mobility, as in the Annex 1 of CLP. And here it refers to results from absorption-desorption testing, together with information, reliable, available information on leaching, on monitoring studies, modeling studies that derive the KOC basically that can be compared to the legal criteria. And also in the section of the legal text referring to the weight of evidence, other elements, other approaches are also mentioned, i.e. the organic, the estimation of the organic carbon water partition coefficient via well-developed QSAR tools or extrapolations with KOW can be one of them, or any other type of information that is properly documented, suitable and reliable, as well as relevant. And this needs to be exhibited before such information can be considered in the overall assessment of mobility. So what are these absorption-desorption tests? Here we have quantified some of them, basically the ones based on the test methods that you see on your screen, either the OECD TG 106, the batch equilibrium method, or studies on sewage sludge, or studies based on the HPLC method, or soil leaching columns, or soil thick and thick layer chromatography. So these are some of the examples of valid, reliable tests that can be used for the assessment. And you will see in a while that the guidance will go into detail in each and every one of these studies to say what are the key considerations, what are the validity criteria, what are the assumptions, applicability domains, etc., etc. Secondly, it is this additional information, as I mentioned, that also needs to be taken into account in the overall weight of evidence. As long as, of course, as I said also, some quality parameters relating to documentation and suitability and relevance are properly demonstrated. So now we come to the development, the guidance development process that I have coordinated with a group of colleagues in ECHA. Basically, we were lucky in this sense that we had recently finalized the respective REACH guidance, the PBT guidance, or those of you who know, it's called the R11 guidance. So it was just very recently before the start of this process finalized. So the elements about P and B and T were mostly extracted from there. Then there is some introductory sections where we have some key definitions assembled in our guidance. We have the CLP criteria directly extracted from the legal text. And we have this information about the test methods that I referred in the previous slide. And these studies can be experimental, they can be field studies, they can be from QSARs, modeling, etc., etc. So the guidance goes into detail for the P and the B and the T and the M into these studies. What are the key considerations, the relevance, the reliability, potentially weighing, etc. So we assemble this information, we present this information that is relevant, and then we apply a weight of evidence. The guidance provides both in a theoretical horizontal level, but also in a property-specific level, guidance on how the information would be assembled and assessed basically within this weight of evidence in order to conclude on classification and labeling, as well as provisions for dealing with multiple studies for the same property. For example, if you have several bioaccumulation tests on fish, how and if such information can be assembled and combined. There are a few words, but not really too much on mixture classification. And there are a couple of examples that were mostly adapted from previous SVHC cases, and this refers, of course, only to the PBT cases that have already been identified as SVHCs. So an important element that we tackle in the guidance, which is a horizontal element, is the discrimination between hazard assessment, which is what CLP is all about, and risk assessment approaches that are more relevant to pesticides and biocides. The fact that all the information is going to be assessed in a weight of evidence approach. And of course, there is no request under CLP for new data. So all available information must be assembled and assessed. Of course, as I said, there is some specific considerations of pesticides and also biocides. There's some additional test methods, for example, or approaches that we have tried to integrate into the guidance. Also, we have tried to tackle issues like outliers or what happens when the results of a study are very close, just below or just above a regulatory threshold value. How do we, principles of how to use QSARs and monitoring data or modeling and things like that. Also, we have incorporated relevant European Court rulings into this. And an important point that I need to make is that the guidance is an iterative process. This means basically that this is the version 1. We are building experience. We get cases into the Risk Assessment Committee of ECHA, and then there's scientific developments, and then the guidance can be updated in future years. Here is some key links to follow the process, the CLH consultations and the guidance that was published a couple of days ago, I think, as well as the fact that there are already cases, proposals for harmonized classification labeling for PBT and PMT properties already in ECHA. We are processing currently such cases, three of these cases for these properties. And now coming towards the end of this presentation, I tried to tackle some of the questions that we have been asked quite a lot. One of them that keeps coming is, what happens to substances that have already been identified as substances of very high concern for their PBT or vPvB properties? The answer there is that such substances, the Commission will make sure that such substances will be directly transferred from the candidate list of REACH to Annex 6 of CLP. Substances identified under Article 57F, which is the equivalent level of concern based on, for example, mobility or mobile properties, such cases, because there were no concrete numerical criteria by the time of the finalization of the identification, there needs to be a brand new CLH process in order to decide whether PMT properties are warranted. And the same would go with every other case that has been through, for example, the ECHA's PBT expert group, but there was no conclusion. And here the important thing is that harmonized classification labeling, as we said, it's about when all the information generation has been completed versus other processes and other regulations, for example, under REACH, where data or PPPs or BPR, where information can still be generated and then the substance can be brought into CLP. Also, we are asked quite often what will happen to downstream regulations, downstream consequences, and here Commission is well aware that different pieces of legislation would need to be updated, and this would happen shortly following the very, very recent publishing, I think it's still to be published this year, the CLP 2.0, then the next version, the updated CLP. So after that, we will have the whatever corrective action would be needed in other pieces of legislation. And here to ensure you that regulatory authorities are talking to each other, we have contacts with EFSA, with the Commission, with other regulatory authorities, with member states. We're organizing events, training, communication exercises. So we are aware that some of the substances might be falling under different pieces of legislation, that there are some overlaps, there are some synergies at the same time. So we're aware of that and we're striving towards a clear communication and putting all the actors together. And I want to close with this slide, which is not strictly related to the new hazard classes, but there are a lot of misunderstandings. And I will leave this slide for a few seconds. And basically, you see what is the ECHA Secretariat's mandate. What do we actually do under CLP or the CLH process managing the harmonized classification and labeling versus what we are not doing. So we're not doing experiments. We're not generating new information. We do not have a say, an ultimate say as ECHA Secretariat in what classification is warranted and what not. So I leave this for a few seconds still so that you see. So I wanted to thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to receiving your questions during the Q&A session a little bit later today. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all our presenters. Now for a few take-home messages before we start the live Q&A. The point I really want to highlight here is the enhanced protection through these new hazard classes. So these new classifications under CLP give stronger safeguards for both human health and the environment. They really address emerging risks by helping us to identify substances that pose these newer, more complex challenges. We also have comprehensive, science-based criteria. Our guidance integrates the latest scientific standards to help identify and classify substances like endocrine disruptors, as well as those with persistent, bioaccumulative, toxic, or mobile properties. I also want to highlight that we have a robust opinion-making framework. Our guidance relies on weight of evidence approaches, specific criteria, and clear guidance, ensuring transparency and consistency in how classifications are made. Collaboration and continuous improvement are central for us. Our guidance reflects ongoing consultations with member states, stakeholders, and committees, all of whom support us in refining and enhancing our classification methods as we gain new insights. And last but not least, we are committed to supporting compliance. So we offer a range of tools, clear guidance, and expert support to help you navigate and meet these new classification and labeling requirements. All right, it's time to start our live Q&A. As mentioned at the start, you can send us questions through Slido using the QR code on this slide, or by going to slido.com and adding the event code CLP 2024. The live Q&A lasts until 1 Helsinki time, after which we end the webinar. Remember that if your question is not answered by the end of the event, we will be publishing a Q&A with answers to all the questions soon after. All right, we'll start shortly.
Hello, welcome to this question and answer session on the new CLP hazard classes, which follows the information videos presentations you've just seen. We hope you found them very informative and useful. My name is Simon Uphill and I will be the moderator today for this question and answer session. So hopefully you have submitted any questions you wish to ask via Slido, and those questions will be answered by our panel today. And our panel is made up of presenters who you've just seen on the presentation videos, but we're also joined by Nicholas Anderson, who will be answering questions on ED for human health and REACH related issues. And we're also joined by Paul Ryan, who's the head of unit for the CLP unit here at ECHA. So thank you for submitting all your questions in advance. Just a reminder that the scope of this question and answer session is the new hazard classes in CLP and closely related issues. We won't be taking questions on anything which is out of the scope of today's question and answer session. The questions you've submitted are being sorted by popularity in Slido, and we will endeavour to answer as many of the most popular questions during the hour we have today. However, all the questions will be answered in writing, and those will be provided to all participants after the conclusion of today's question and answer session, when we're able to do so and publish them. So if your question is not answered during the live session today, don't worry, you will receive an answer provided that your question was in the scope of the question and answer session. However, please note that we will not be answering questions on subject-specific issues, as we're not in a position to do that today. And just for general information, today's session is being recorded, and this recording will be available to all afterwards on the ECHA website. So I think then, with the introductions made, we can move on to answering the questions that we've been submitted. And the first question, top of the list today, is: what does the implementation of the new hazard classes mean for already fully registered substances? Do new substances have to be conducted? Do new studies have to be conducted, or do already performed results have to be reassessed retrospectively? And for this question, we will go to Stina. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. So in general, CLP does not require performing new testing, and the obligation to generate new data follows from other legislation such as REACH, the Biocides Regulation, or the Pesticides Regulations. But for classification purposes, all available data have to be assessed. So if you already have data which are relevant for the new hazard classes, these have to be included in the assessment and comparison with the new criteria. And we can follow up with further details on this also in the written response later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So on to the next question. Will mixtures that are classified as endocrine disruptors, because they contain a substance classified as an ED, be restricted to the general public? Currently, there are no restrictions in Annex 17, but is this the ultimate goal? For this one, we'll go over to Paul. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks. A good question. And it's hard to give a specific answer, but I'll try to explain it. So in CLP, there's a clear priority given now to endocrine disruptors in the CLP that's been revised and published yesterday, actually, where it says that EDs are equivalent in terms of priority and severity to carcinogenic, mutagenic, reprotoxic substances and respiratory sensitizers. So CLP gives a clear indication as to how EDs should be treated. But then whether generic or specific restrictions would apply in other legislation that is relevant to the substance depends really on those sectoral pieces of legislation. If the question also asks about whether REACH restrictions would be likely, this again is dependent on the case, so it's hard to give a specific answer. But it's for the member state who motivates that restriction to consider if it's the best tool to protect users from the hazard. But like I said, CLP in itself gives an indication. But the other legislation would be what to refer to see if generic or specific restrictions would apply.
Thank you very much. Next question we've received. Does the principle no data, no classification apply? Costas.
Thank you, Simon. You probably refer to the REACH principle of no data, no registration, we would assume. So whether a self-classification under REACH or a harmonized classification under CLP applies refers to the assessment, as we just heard from Stine as well, of all available existing information, as well as the comparison with the respective regulatory criteria. In this sense, when information is not available, when data is not available, and the substance is brought into harmonized classification, for example, then a conclusion of no classification based on lack of data would need to be reached. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Costas. So moving on. Not being able to provide any examples on ED2 due to divergent views would seem to indicate that the guidance is not sufficiently robust to conclude on this hazard class. Decisions should not be left up to expert judgment by default, as such decisions would lack consistency. Nicholas, this one's for you.
Yes, thank you, Simon. During the guidance development, we had extensive discussions on what could be an example for category 2, and unfortunately we were unable to reach consensus on what is a category 2, and this is a similar issue for other category 2 hazard classes as well, and we are well aware that we need more guidance on this, and we will address this as soon as we have enough information to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. So moving on to looks like a PMT related question. How to assess chemicals where log KOC cannot be measured or calculated due to their insolubility in water and octanol? Costas, this one's for you.
Yeah, this question refers to mostly to information generation, which is outside the scope of this webinar. As we just heard, all relevant information needs to be assessed, needs to be assembled and assessed. And when we were developing the CLP guidance, we have tried to be as inclusive for different chemical classes as possible. And it is our understanding that this question refers to a very small minority of substances that are both insoluble and lowly sorbed. So we are assuming that this would not be the case. However, experimental methods, for example, like the OECD TG 106, need to be pursued. And if there is no analytical method developed, there needs to be an analytical method developed to measure the log KOC. If this is still not possible, then we need to assess the available information as it is presented, and then based on the overall information, a conclusion needs to be made accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you, Costas. So the next question. Does listing on the candidate list, SVHC, based on ED properties lead to automatic classification of the new hazard classes? And that one is for Kirsi.
Thank you very much, Simon. Yes, in principle, they are considered as category 1 EDs, but yesterday there was this new revision for CLP published in the official journal, and if you look at that more closely, you can see in Article 37, paragraph 7, that Commission delegated act is needed for this transfer to the CLP Annex 6. And we have some transitional periods and timelines there in this Article 37. And actually, because it's not so easy, we will put more clarity on these timelines on our website in coming weeks. But in principle, as explained by Stine in her presentation, you can already voluntarily classify for EDs, and there are transitional periods that apply for the classification. So, for instance, for substances that are new coming to the EU market. The deadline is 1st of May next year, 25. And all available data needs to be considered as explained by Stina in her presentation. So also this type of data should be considered. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsi. So the next question. ECHA has for PBT both a candidate list and a PBT assessment list. Will there be an alignment of lists for PBT, vPvB, ED, or a statement with official lists? Costas.
Thank you. So I think I need to give a quite similar answer as the one that Kirsi has just given. Basically, you refer to the substances that have already been identified as PBTs in the REACH substance of very high concern process, as well as being discussed in the ECHA's PBT expert group. So the answer is that for those substances that have already identified as PBTs or vPvBs, according to REACH Article 57D or E, those will be transferred into Annex 6 of CLP pursuant to this delegated act that Kirsi was talking about. Everything else that has not been an official decision by the Commission would need to be reassessed or be brought to the harmonized classification process or self-classified under REACH. Thank you.
Thank you, Costas. So the next question we have here. The new classification for ED seems strongly positively biased towards classification in category 1 or 2, with an impossible burden to prove the absence or non-relevance of effects. Many chemicals are expected to be classified. Does the system therefore not miss its target to protect human health or the environment? I think I'm going to ask Paul to comment on this one, if I may.
No problem, Simon, thanks. Well, you heard Nicholas explaining earlier it was difficult for the guidance to deliver clear examples of what category 2 might look like, but it does give guidance on what category 2 is, and it's quite similar to the other hazard classes, I would say, where you don't have the same level of confidence in a category 1, you can go down to category 2. So I wouldn't say it's biased towards category 1 because there's no examples there. Similarly for no classification. And we'll learn, I think, by the time the RAC, the Risk Assessment Committee, has looked at some of these cases and decided what the difference between category 1 and category 2 is. We'll discover those examples and we can reflect it back in the guidance update. What I would also maybe add is that category 1s, as they are in the guidance, are carried over from WHO criteria, carried over from ECHA-EFSA guidance, and existing substances that have already been assessed as EDs in other legislation. So the category 1s in themselves are fairly understood, which is why you see that more prominent in the guidance, but it doesn't mean that it's biased towards category 1. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So moving on to the next, we have a two-parter. So I'll start with part 1, and then we'll get an answer from Stina, and then we'll have a look at question 2. So question 1, when should substances that are REACH registered, in parentheses existing substances, be self-classified in accordance with the new CLP hazard classes? Stina?
Thank you, Simon. So in principle, companies should start to classify their substances and mixtures already now. For substances which are placed on the market before 1st of May 2025, the deadline for applying the new classification and labeling is mandatory from 1st of November 2026. And similarly for substances placed on the market after 1st of May 2025, the deadline is 1st of May 2025. Yeah, and similar timelines are also in place for mixture, and I mentioned these also in my presentation earlier today. Thank you.
Thank you. And then question 2. Do substances sold or offered for sale to third parties before 1st of May 2025, but not yet delivered to them, need to be reclassified? And if yes, by when?
I think this might be a question that we might need to come back to in more detail in our written answers. Thank you, Simon.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So, moving on. In regard to the choice of no classification for ED human health, is there any definition as to when the data set for a substance is sufficient to conclude when the assessor should select no classification based on a lack of data? And this is for Nicholas.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. I think first we need to be very clear on that there are no testing requirements on the CLP. Testing requirements for is governed by other legislation such as REACH pesticides and biocides regulation, for example, and under REACH it also varies depending on the tonnage band of the substance produced, which then, but CLP would look at all information available and based on that conclude either that classification is warranted or that it's not warranted. So no classification, and that no classification can be due to no data, and it could also be due to inconclusive data. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So then, is there a minimum water solubility in place or planned for the mobility assessment of poorly soluble low toxicity materials, otherwise known as PSLTs? And this one's for Kostas.
No, there is no minimum solubility in place, and there is no current plan to introduce one for the mobility assessment. As we said before, the assessment of the data will need to proceed in a weight of evidence manner, where all validated, relevant, and reliable experimental and other types of information is put together and assessed. If there is a need based on some specific substance properties that there needs to be some kind of a replacement, of an adjustment of the test method, this needs to be clearly explained and documented. Otherwise, no minimum requirement in place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kostas. So, how to correctly deal with an endocrine disruptor in a mixture? Some ED substances have an impact even at very low concentrations. Does dilution play a role? Could ECHA give an example about how to correctly classify a mixture containing an endocrine disrupting substance? And this one is for Kirsi.
Thank you, Simon. This is quite many questions in one question, but I try to cover all of them. So in the CLP legal text, there are so-called generic concentration limits, very similar to, for instance, as for carcinogens. And this means that if a mixture contains ED component above this generic limit 0.1% for CAT1 substances or 1% for CAT2 substances, then classification for mixture would apply. However, some of the EDs, as we know, are really potent. So, for example, if you have a mixture containing an ingredient that is classified for ED human health 1, and this dose causing the ED effects suggest this high potency for this component, then it deviates from this generic concentration limit, and the substance in the mixture may have a specific concentration limit that can be very low, like 0.01 or 0.001, even lower. And then the mixture needs to be classified if it's this component concentration is above this limit. For mixture classification, for EDs, you also need to consider additivity in some cases. So if there are several ingredients that are classified for EDs and they have a similar mechanism, mode of action, or adverse outcome, then their concentrations may need to be summed up and compared to the threshold for classification. And about this dilution, when diluting a mixture even more, then you may apply this bridging principle dilution, but you should consider that what is the final concentration of the ED constituent in the mixture, and that gives the best estimate for a proper classification. And all of this and much more is explained in our new guidance, and we can think about of providing also examples for mixture classification. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kirsi. So the next question. In the new CLP revision, it states that suppliers have 6 months to update a label. I'm looking for clarification. Is this all products on the market? Does an old product need to be removed from the shelves? Is the product being produced at the supplier's facility? This is a huge concern for industry. This is for Stina.
Thank you, Simon. Well, this is a rather complex question, and as Kirsi already mentioned, the new CLP revision, which was published yesterday, lays down several transitional provisions for the benefit of industry, and we will come back to these in more details in our written response to the questions and also on our website in the coming weeks.
Thank you very much. If a substance based on ED properties is listed on the candidate list, SVHC, will this lead to an automatic classification in an APT? I presume that means an ATP, and this one is for Kirsi.
Thank you. I think I already had a very similar question, which I replied. So in principle, they are considered as Cat 1, but you can see in this CLP revision, Article 37, paragraph 7, that Commission delegated act is needed for this, and there are also the timelines for this delegated act. So this, but as I already answered, on voluntary basis, classification can be applied, and the transitional already now and transitional periods, as explained by Steen in her presentation, they apply.
Thank you very much. So then, another ED-related question. For dismissing ED classification due to other toxicity, please clarify more comparative MOA, that's mode of action analysis. What should be considered to be accepted for no classification? This one is for Nicholas.
Yes, thank you. I think this is very case specific, and you need to have look at the case in hand. But in general, you need to show that the other toxicity is a that the endocrine activity is a non-specific consequence of other toxicity, and so I guess you will have to look at all the Bradford-Hill criteria in a systematic manner to conclude on this. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. So, will there be an alignment in classification criteria for example, endocrine disrupting properties in BPR, CLP, and so forth? And for this one, we have Marta.
Thank you, Simon. So basically, it's very important to highlight here that the current ED criteria for pesticides and biocides have been derived based on the same principles and scientific basis as the Category 1 ED for human health and environment under the CLP, so that substances that are identified as as ED under pesticides and biocides legislation will be assigned as ED Category 1. But maybe here it's as well worth mentioning that for the substances that have not yet been identified under pesticides or biocidal legislation as ED. And if they have the new information on the ED, then when the substance is assessed or reassessed, it could become category 1 or 2, depending on the criteria. And for more, I would send to the Article 37. It's a kind of similar question like candidate list that Kirsi was answering already. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the next question. Is there any intention to solve the problem that the new classification or the new hazard classes are incorporated only into CLP but are not in GHS? If yes, when approximately can we expect that GHS will also contain these new hazard classes? Kostas.
Thank you. I'm not sure I would call it a problem, but yes, there is an intention to do that. And as we speak, the full process of discussing the need and the possibility for the new hazard class to be introduced also to UN GHS is fully underway. So the process, which is a rather complicated one, which includes also inclusion of OECD, has been started already some months ago. And there are two parallel streams, one for ED and the other one is for the PMTs that will be followed by the PBTs as well. So this process is fully underway. As there's lots of factors involved and lots of countries, etc., it's gonna take some time. So my guess is that we will not probably see anything within the next couple of years, but maybe I'm proven wrong. So it's gonna take a little bit of time, but discussions are underway. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kostas. So the next question we have is a double header, really. Starting with, in practice, different legislations can lead to different classification conclusions. How to deal with this when an active substance is concluded to be not ED under the PPPR, but does meet the ED criteria under CLP. Which one takes precedence? Nicholas?
Okay, let's start with the last part of the question so that we start with CLP applies to all substances. It's a cross-arching legislation and a pesticides regulation only concerns pesticides. So that's a sector-specific legislation. So that from that point of view, CLP would be taking the lead. For the other question, it's a bit ambiguous how it's written, but I assume that because concluded not to be ED, does that mean concluded not to be ED due to the fact that EFSA, when they did the assessment, had a complete data set and had all the information needed? Or is it that they have not concluded based on the information they have, but asked for more information? I think that's one thing. And then also, if EFSA has concluded not ED for a substance with a complete data set and new information later occurs that makes it an ED, I guess that in theory could happen, but I would consider that fairly unlikely. But otherwise, I don't think that there will be that much of a missing conclusion here, and we are striving for one substance and one assessment. So I think if EFSA has concluded something, it would be considered, that conclusion would be considered also for a harmonized classification when you come to that. Thank you.
Thanks. There was an addendum to this as well in the replies, which I'll just put to you as well, Nicholas. If CLP is leading, which we just clarified that it is, would this pesticidal active substance then not be approved via ECHA, even if the classification concludes that it is not an ED?
I guess this is also a very hypothetical question, based on one substance, one assessment reasoning. I would not think this would happen unless there's a substantial amount of new information that EFSA didn't look at in the first place. And this is I guess it is still possible that you have a substance concluded as not meeting the ED criteria, but they are later classified as EDCAT2 based on CLP criteria, because EFSA does not look at EDCAT2. The pesticides and biocides criteria are the same as ED category 1.
Thank you very much. We have a question here about UFI registrations. If new hazard classes are added to a mixture, we would recommend consulting with the help desk for these. We receive a number of questions on this issue. The help desk is collecting these and is developing answers, so we would recommend contacting the relevant help desk with relation to these, and we'll provide some details as is possible in the written responses. So I think we can move on past that one for now. So the next question: where must the study for endocrine disruptors be performed? Only if ED properties are expected? Question mark. This is for Stina.
Thank you, Simon. So I think I already mentioned this in the previous reply. So in general, CLP doesn't require performing any testing, and the classification is based on available information, and further that the obligation to generate new data follows from other legislation such as REACH and biocide and pesticide regulations.
Maybe I can add to that there is
Sure.
no specific study for endocrine disruption. There's multiple studies that answers different aspects of endocrine disruption, and given the type of information that you already had, a different type of studies might be needed if one wants to further investigate endocrine disrupting properties. Thank you.
Thank you both. The next question refers to information on safety data sheets. Again, we've received a number of questions regarding safety data sheets and when a substance is classified or indeed not classified for one of the new hazard classes. On safety data sheet issues, we would again recommend contacting the help desk as they will be gathering these questions and providing some responses. And again, we'll put something in the written replies to these questions that you will all receive at a later date. So we will move on to the next question. Under CLP, no generation of studies or data is required. What if the existing dataset is insufficient for labeling, since due to regulatory requirements, there was no need to generate this data? For these cases, data lacking would be the correct choice for labeling. Do you agree? Do you agree, Kostas?
I do agree. Very short.
Thank you.
One more issue that we hope such cases will not end up on our plate or on the plate of the regulatory authorities. So we hope that when all data generation has been completed, then the substances can move into risk management or whatever other regulatory process. So we hope that we don't see this, but if this is the case for whatever reason, then no classification due to lack of data will be warranted.
Thank you very much. Very clear. Moving on. When adverse effects observed on the thyroid gland, additional mechanistic information not necessarily required to meet ED criteria. And that's in speech marks. However, if one can prove that those thyroid effects are caused by excess toxicity, will the substance still be considered as an ED? Nicholas, this one's for you.
I guess now the question is what is meant with excess toxicity in this context, and I assume that it is meant hepatic liver enzyme induction, and having data on that, on hepatic enzyme induction would only confirm a human relevant mode of action for the thyroid. So we do not consider hepatic enzyme induction as excessive toxicity. And in the other situation where you would have excessive toxicity, then it would be this other legal provision that is in the guidance that talks about other non-specific consequences of other toxicity, and then one would have to do the same type of comparative mode of action analysis to demonstrate that as for any other effect, not only thyroid. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And maybe I could also add that regarding other toxicity, there are a lot of questions, but we have actually a dedicated section in the new guidance on this. So for human health, you can look at the guidance section 3.11 2.2.1 on how to assess this concurrent other toxicity. So basically, if you have this other toxicity on which is excessive, so severe, for instance, that the animals were prostrate or dying, you can then dismiss the ED type of effects from classification on those levels. But when there is no such excessive other toxicity, then as Niklas said, then a comparative mode of action analysis would be needed to show that this effect is not linked to endocrine mode of action.
And I may add as well that we do have as well the section in the environmental part on this. So please have a look.
Thank you all. Very comprehensive answer there. The next question relates to medicinal products. Many human medicinal products affect the endocrine system and regulate endocrine activity and are designed to be used to manipulate the endocrine system, as opposed to substances which may be synthesized for a different process and happen to be EDs. Should these be classified as endocrine disruptors? Well, I can clarify for you here that CLP does not apply to medicinal products, as they are covered by different legislation. However, of course, some substances may be used in a variety of different contexts, and they may well be classified in those other contexts, but the message here is that CLP doesn't apply to medicinal products. So I hope that's clarified for you. Moving on, could you please elaborate on how these changes might impact business, particularly in terms of compliance with labelling, packaging and safety data sheet requirements? Are there specific industries or types of substances that are likely to be affected more significantly than others? And this one is for Paul.
Thanks. Good question again. I think we're very aware that there's an impact of any piece of legislation that changes on businesses. What I would say about these particular questions, this is about this event today, and the actual slides you see and the answers we're giving are about the guidance and interpretation of the criteria, which is why you heard the answer earlier that we talk about, SDS and poison center information is rather for somewhere else. But we will do some work to answer all of these questions, by the way. In terms of labeling guidance with the CLP revision, we're working on a labeling guidance update, which will come next year. You won't see that in this guidance because it's not the purpose of this guidance. But we'll and as regards specific industries or types of substances to be affected, it's very difficult to give an answer to that. Maybe the industries themselves would know better how much they're impacted, depending on what products they use, what kind of labels they have, etc. But it's not intended to be more affecting one particular sector than another. But like I said, rest assured there'll be plenty of information to come on how to do this. But the scope of the event today is more about the guidance on the criteria. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. Moving on. What happens with substances which are in transit, e.g. being shipped towards the EU on the 1st of May 2025, but not yet in EU customs territory? Do they need to be self-classified for the new hazard classes, and by when? And that one is for Stina.
Thank you, Simon. Again, very good and important questions, but we have to look further into this and come back to the answer in writing.
Thanks. Yeah, indeed, a complex matter. We can better provide responses in the written responses sheet. So thank you, Stina. Next question. Should we expect pictograms in the future? Of course, there aren't any at present. Nicholas, can you help us there?
Yeah, yes. Pictograms were considered when the ED CLP criteria were developed. However, the pictograms used in the CLP comes from the globally harmonized system, which under the UN, and there are currently ongoing discussions to include endocrine disruption in the globally harmonized system as well. And should that be implemented there, there may be a pictogram in the future, and that's about all I can say on this at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the next question. Are we as downstream users obliged to classify our mixtures containing substances with harmonized CLP classifications for the new hazard classes over the limit in CLP, even though the suppliers of the substances have not updated the classification of the substances in their safety data sheets, which they provide us with? And I will offer this one to Paul.
Yeah, the easy answer is yes. I mean, the rules apply to everybody. So, I mean, I would encourage the downstream users to work with their suppliers to make sure this is done, and pay attention to the work also and the guidance.
Great, thank you very much. What kind of QSAR models could be used to evaluate the mobility of substances which are currently not completely accepted as input of the existing models? Episweet, ionized molecules, metal complexes, for example. For such compounds, the application of the recommended TG is also limited. So it's a question on QSAR models, and this one is for Kostas.
Thank you. So on this, I need to just repeat what we have already in the guidance. Basically, in the guidance, we have already some example models, QSARs by name that can be used. But this indeed, as correctly identified in the question, refers to non-ionizable, non-surface active organic substances only. So for ionizable substances, as you know, the respective models of the development is not as advanced as for non-ionizables. So we decided not to include by name any such models, even though in recent years there have been good efforts either on the development of polyparameter linear free energy relationship type of models or other types of models that could in theory be used. So we decided because of their development stage and for other reasons not to include any examples. And to conclude, I would just like to repeat also that the conclusion on the classification on the hazard class will be a result of the weighing of all available relevant types of information. So all information needs to be included: monitoring, modeling, QSARs, experimental methods, etc., for ionizables within applicability domains, and then the risk assessment committee of ECHA for harmonized classification will come to an ultimate opinion after evaluating all this information. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the next question, a very direct question. When can we expect new classifications in Annex 6 to CLP? Stina?
That's a good question. So I think we can expect to see the first classification included in Annex 6 to CLP in 2026. This also relates to the delegated acts, which Kirsi also referred to earlier for the transition of SVHCs into classification and labeling. So yeah, I think 2026 is the earliest year we can see the new classifications in Annex 6.
Thank you very much. Moving on. For ED classification, is there an obligation of conducting an assessment according to the ECHA guidance and to fill in Appendix EXL? The example assessments given in the ECHA guidance on the application of the CLP criteria are much more summarised. Would an assessment like that be okay? Kirsi?
Thank you, Simon. I think something that could be very helpful on this is to look at the new CLH template, which is available on our website for submitting a CLH dossier, where you can see the relevant tables, how they look in this new CLH template on, for instance, on assessing lines of evidence for endocrine disruptors. And on the other hand, for PPPs and biocides, there are also these combined templates already available, how you see how to assess the classification. So this might be helpful for that kind of assessment and for classification. Thanks.
Thank you very much. How would you assess mobility of insoluble substances such as nanomaterials where the KOW and KOC do not accurately reflect the behavior in the environment? Kostas.
I need to repeat the same type of answer that I have already given. Basically, that the legislator has introduced the KOC as the numerical index based on which whether the classification will be warranted or not needs to be compared with. Again, if a given experimental method is not applicable because of the properties of a substance, if for whatever other reason a given test or test results are deemed that are not fully reflecting the behavior of a substance, this needs to be properly documented, reported, and brought to the regulatory authority with its justification. And then the regulatory authority, the RAC of ECHA, for example, for harmonized classification, will take all available information and decide. Information that is not relevant, like a test method outside the applicability domain, etc., will be weighed accordingly to come to a conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kostas. The next question. If a mixture is classified as ED-ENV, does this lead to the obligation to notify a PCN portal like it does for ED human health? Marta, this one's for you.
Thank you, Simon. Unfortunately, I don't have answer for this, and I would send the person who was asking the question as well to ECHA help desk, as they are collecting the questions on this issue, and they will have the best answer for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the next question then. How can you consider that any thyroid findings should be considered by default as an ED effect when some of them have been shown to be the consequence of adaptive changes, e.g. increased liver metabolism, as referenced in an EFSA document? Nicholas, this one's for you.
First of all, I think we need to start with saying that we have two different guidance documents. We have one, the EFSA guidance from 2018, and then we have the CLP guidance. And the scope of these two documents are different. The scope of the ECHA-EFSA guidance was to how to generate the information needed to conclude on the pesticides or biocides ED criteria, keeping in mind the fact that there's an information requirement under these regulations to generate the information, the ED information to the extent possible. The CLP scope is to look at whether or not you meet the CLP ED criteria or not. So there's a difference here. And then both guidances says that all thyroid modes of actions are human relevant. The questions here about the about consequence of adaptive changes has for a long time been an argument about human relevance. And during the 5 years since the publish of the guidance, in which ECHA and EFSA proposed a way forward on how to prove non-human relevance of liver thyroid effects, the experience gathered over these 5 years clearly shows that this endeavor is an utter failure. There's not a single case demonstrated that where you can show that liver enzyme induction is not human relevant. And also the main concern for thyroid changes in the adults are that its effects on cognitive function and the developable fetus is affected regardless of whether it's a liver enzyme induction or something else that is a molecular initiating event. So in principle, these guidance documents are not contradicting each other. You just have to consider the scope of the two documents and what their purpose is. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. Very comprehensive answer there. The next question: if a mixture contains 1 PMT and 1 PBT substance above the concentration limit, does the mixture need to be classified for both categories? Kostas.
Yes. Short answer. Yes, for proper hazard identification as well as communication purposes, especially in the future that we will have pictograms, most likely, the answer is yes.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Moving on. By deleting examples for ED category 2 and non-classification, this guidance is inoperable. If a clear classification in these classes is not possible, how can category 2 or non-classification be demanded from anyone, in particular from small or medium-sized companies which don't have in-house experts? Paul.
Thanks, Simon. I'll call back to the answer I gave earlier. So I think, well, we've explained the reasons why there's no particular examples on category 2 or no classification, but there is guidance on it. And what we can promise to do is, as things develop and we get examples, for example, via harmonized classification process, where the risk assessment committee decides on a category 1 or a category 2, we can reflect those back into the guidance at a later stage. So I'm well aware that it's an issue for small and medium companies, who don't have the expertise for this. But at the moment, the reality is that it's the risk assessment committee who will do this work now to define category 1 or category 2 or self-classifiers when they're not confident that if they have effects that are meeting category 1, that they can use category 2. But there is guidance on that in the criteria, in the guidance and criteria.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have just a couple of minutes left, so we've got time for one more question. And I think it's appropriate that the next question actually regards the follow-up to this. So, will the workshops on ED classification foreseen for 2025 be open to all? If not, will there be a workshop report? Kirsi?
Thank you very much, Simon. I think this is a good question to end. So we are planning to have various of events on the new hazard classes next year. Some of them are only for the member state CAs and committees, but there will be also some open events that you can attend as stakeholders, industry, NGOs, everyone. So please stay in touch through our website, and you will find some events next year where you can get more training and capacity building on these new hazard classes.
Lovely. Thank you very much. I hope that answered the question posed there. So that brings us to the end of our time together, I'm afraid. Thank you very much for all the questions. We hope that the answers we provided here helped to answer them, but do not despair if your question wasn't answered in the Q&A here today. We will be providing written responses to all the questions we've received, which are in the scope. So once again, thanks to our panelists. Thank you to everybody who's joined us today and submitted questions. And we will hopefully see you at some point in the future. So a good afternoon here from Helsinki in Finland.